What made you go on your villain arc? My son's name was Ethan, and he was 8 years old when a drunk driver named Vincent Caldwell killed him on a Wednesday evening in October. I was working the night shift at Mercy General Hospital when I got the call, and by the time I made it to the emergency room where I'd spent the last 12 years as a trauma nurse, my son was already gone. The doctor who pronounced him dead was someone I'd worked alongside for years, and I watched her hands shake as she tried to find words that didn't exist, apologies that couldn't bring back the child who'd been waiting at the crosswalk with his backpack still on his shoulders. Vincent Caldwell had blown through a red light going 60 in a 35 zone with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, and my son had died on impact while the drunk driver walked away with minor bruises and a broken wrist. The police told me he'd been coming from some corporate event at a downtown hotel, celebrating another successful quarter at the investment firm where he served as CEO. They said it apologetically, like his wealth and position were somehow relevant to the fact that he'd murdered my child, and I suppose in retrospect they were preparing me for what came next. The arraignment happened 3 weeks after Ethan's funeral, and I sat in that courtroom watching Vincent Caldwell stand beside his lawyers in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. He was 46 years old, handsome in that polished executive way, with silver at his temples and the kind of confident posture that comes from never facing real consequences in your entire life. His attorney was a man named Buchanan who specialized in defending wealthy clients against DUI charges, and I watched him work the courtroom like a performance artist, explaining how his client was a pillar of the community who'd made a terrible mistake after having just one drink too many at a charity fundraiser. He painted my son's death as a tragic accident rather than a predictable result of Vincent's choice to drive drunk, and when the judge set bail at $200,000, Vincent's wife had a check ready before the hearing even ended. He walked out of that courthouse a free man pending trial, and I stood on the steps watching him climb into a black Mercedes SUV while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions he ignored with practiced ease. Something cold and final settled into my chest as I watched him drive away, a calculation forming that I didn't fully understand yet, but would come to define the next year of my life. The trial took 7 months to get to court, and during that time I learned everything there was to know about Vincent Caldwell's carefully constructed existence. He lived in a gated community called Riverside Estates with his wife Patricia and their 2 teenage children, a boy and a girl who attended Preston Academy. His investment firm managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions, and his social media presence was carefully curated images of charity galas and success. I went to every pretrial hearing and watched his defense team systematically dismantle the prosecution's case with motions and technicalities, challenging the blood alcohol test timing and suggesting my son had somehow darted into traffic despite 3 witnesses who swore Ethan had been standing still. By the time we got to trial, they'd created enough reasonable doubt that I could see it in the jury's faces, the subtle shift from certainty to confusion that Buchanan had orchestrated through weeks of expert testimony and character witnesses. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon, guilty of vehicular manslaughter rather than vehicular homicide, and the distinction mattered because it meant Vincent would serve minimal time instead of decades. Sentencing day arrived 6 weeks later, and Judge Mariana Ellis delivered a sentence that made my vision narrow to a tunnel point. 6 months in minimum security with work release privileges, followed by 5 years probation. Vincent Caldwell would serve exactly 63 days before being released on good behavior, and I sat frozen while my ex-wife sobbed beside me, both of us understanding that we'd just witnessed the price of a child's life when the killer could afford excellent legal representation. I took a leave of absence from Mercy General that week, telling my supervisor I needed time to grieve, which was technically true even if my grieving was taking a darker turn than anyone imagined. I spent those 2 months while Vincent served his minimal sentence learning everything about his life, his routines, his business dealings, his medical history. The last part was easier than it should have been because I still had access to the hospital's patient database through the VPN they'd given me for remote charting, and Vincent had been treated at Mercy General 3 years earlier for a minor surgery. His medical records showed he was diabetic, type 2, managed with metformin and supposedly careful diet. All of this was documented in files I had no legal right to access, but I'd stopped caring about rules the moment my son's body hit the pavement. The night Vincent was released from minimum security, I watched from my car as he walked out with Patricia waiting in that same Mercedes. They drove straight to an upscale restaurant where they celebrated with champagne and expensive steaks, and I sat in the parking lot watching them through the window, watching him laugh like the past 3 months had been nothing more than an inconvenient interruption. Something crystallized in me then, a plan that had been forming in fragments suddenly becoming clear and actionable. I went back to work at Mercy General the following week, and everyone was careful around me in that way people get when tragedy has touched someone they know. My supervisor welcomed me back and said the emergency department had missed me, never suspecting that I'd returned not to heal but to acquire the tools I'd need for something darker. I started volunteering for extra shifts, making myself indispensable, ensuring that my presence became so routine that nobody would question why I was accessing certain areas or systems. I needed to be invisible in plain sight, just another dedicated nurse working too many hours because she needed the distraction from grief. Vincent's medication was the key, but acquiring and switching it presented challenges I needed to solve carefully. His prescriptions were filled at Davidson Pharmacy 3 blocks from his office, picked up during lunch on the first Thursday of every month with clockwork regularity. The pharmacy had security cameras covering the main counter and entrance, but I'd visited multiple times under the pretense of filling my own prescriptions and noticed the blind spot near the pickup window where returned medications sat before being restocked. I spent weeks observing the staff patterns, learning which pharmacist worked Thursdays and when they took their breaks, identifying the exact moments when the prescription area was unwatched for 30 to 40 seconds. I acquired metformin in various dosages through the hospital pharmacy, taking 1 or 2 pills at a time from multiple bottles to avoid triggering inventory alerts, building up a supply that would let me switch Vincent's correctly dosed medication with either overdoses or underdoses depending on which would cause more medical chaos. The hospital's medication tracking system logged every access, but I'd learned to cover my tracks by documenting false patient administrations that would pass casual auditing, creating paper trails that showed the medication going to patients who'd been discharged or transferred before anyone could verify. The first switch happened in early November, and I'd planned it with the precision of a military operation. I arrived at Davidson Pharmacy at 11:45, wearing business casual clothes instead of scrubs, carrying a legitimate prescription I actually needed filled. Vincent's prescription had been ready since that morning according to the pharmacy's automated system, sitting in the pickup bin with a dozen others. The pharmacist on duty was helping an elderly customer with a complicated insurance issue, her back turned to the bins, and I positioned myself at the counter with a clear view of both the pharmacist and the door. The moment stretched out as I waited for the perfect window, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone in the pharmacy must hear it. When another customer entered and called the pharmacist's attention, I reached across the counter and swapped the label on Vincent's medication with one I'd printed at home, replacing his correct 1,000 milligram dosage with pills containing 1,500 milligrams. The switch took 18 seconds and nobody noticed because I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, a customer waiting patiently for service. I left with my antibiotics and watched from my car as Vincent arrived exactly on schedule 30 minutes later, walking into the pharmacy and emerging 5 minutes later with a white bag containing medication that would begin his destruction. The first signs appeared within 2 weeks when Vincent came into Mercy General's emergency room late on a Saturday night with extreme fatigue and muscle weakness he couldn't explain. I wasn't working that shift, but I accessed his chart remotely through the hospital VPN, reading the attending's notes about wildly unstable blood sugar, despite the patient's insistence he'd been taking his medication correctly. They kept him overnight and adjusted his treatment protocol, never suspecting the medication itself was the problem. I felt satisfaction so intense it was almost physical, watching the plan work exactly as I'd calculated. But I also felt the first stirrings of genuine fear because I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and if anyone ever made the connection between Vincent's medical crisis and my access to his records, everything would unravel. I started taking precautions I should have implemented from the beginning, using a secondary laptop with a VPN that routed through multiple servers to access his records, never logging in from my home IP address, always clearing my browser history and cache. I created a false schedule in my head of when I'd supposedly been sleeping, or at the gym during times I was actually surveillance Vincent, building alibis for moments that might later become important. The second medication switch happened in December, but this time I nearly got caught. The pharmacist was more attentive than usual, her eyes sweeping the counter area frequently, and I'd almost aborted the attempt twice before finding a window that felt safe enough. I made the switch in 12 seconds this time, my hands steady despite my racing heart, but as I turned away, I saw the security camera's angle and realized it might have captured my hand reaching across the counter. I walked out of the pharmacy, forcing myself to move normally, got in my car, and drove 3 blocks before pulling over to vomit in a gas station bathroom. The paranoia hit me then in full force, the realization that I'd been reckless and left evidence that could destroy me. I spent the next week expecting police to show up at my door or hospital security to pull me aside for questioning, but nothing happened. The pharmacy's security footage was probably only reviewed if there was a complaint or incident, and nobody had any reason to suspect anything unusual had occurred. Still, I knew I couldn't keep making direct switches without eventually being noticed, and I needed to adapt my approach. Vincent's medical decline accelerated through December and January, as the medication I'd switched continued poisoning him slowly. He was admitted to Mercy General 3 more times with symptoms his doctors struggled to explain, each visit documenting new complications that suggested his diabetes was completely out of control. I'd started monitoring his medical records obsessively, logging in through secure VPN connections at random times to avoid creating suspicious patterns. But in late January, something in his chart made my blood run cold. A new specialist, Dr. Reeves, had been brought in to consult, and she'd ordered independent testing of Vincent's medications to verify their composition and dosage. I read her notes 3 times, my hands shaking, understanding that if they found evidence of tampering, the investigation would trace back through the pharmacy's records and security footage. I was looking at potential murder charges and the end of everything I'd worked for, but I couldn't undo what I'd already done. I made the decision to stop the medication switches immediately, to let Vincent's body recover enough that the toxicology investigation wouldn't find active poisoning, and to shift to methods that wouldn't leave physical evidence in pill form. Dr. Reeves's results came back showing inconsistent dosages in Vincent's medication, which she attributed to manufacturing error rather than tampering. She reported it to the FDA and switched Vincent to different medications from a different pharmacy, and I felt relief so intense I actually cried in my car reading her notes. I'd gotten away with it by pure luck, saved by a doctor's assumption that pharmaceutical companies make mistakes rather than suspecting deliberate poisoning. But my direct access to Vincent's medications was gone, and I needed a completely different approach to finish what I'd started. The answer came from an unexpected source, a conversation I overheard between 2 infectious disease doctors discussing antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Mercy General's infectious disease ward had multiple strains of MRSA and other superbugs, and with my access to that area, acquiring a sample would be straightforward if I was extraordinarily careful. The plan that formed was elegant in its simplicity. I would culture aggressive bacteria from patient samples, then introduce them into Vincent's environment in ways that would cause infections difficult to treat. The beauty was that it would look like random bad luck rather than deliberate harm. I spent 3 weeks preparing the bacterial culture, growing particularly aggressive strains of MRSA in a small incubator I'd purchased online and kept hidden in my apartment. The process required careful temperature control and sterile technique, skills I'd learned during nursing school and refined over years of clinical practice. I wore gloves constantly while handling the cultures, paranoid about contaminating myself or leaving trace evidence that could be found later. The bacteria grew beautifully, multiplying in the culture medium until I had enough to create multiple infection vectors. I transferred the culture to a small spray bottle designed to look like hand sanitizer, something innocuous I could carry without raising questions. Vincent had started attending physical therapy at a clinic that shared a parking structure with a medical building, and his routine was predictable because wealthy men loved their schedules. He always parked in the same section near the elevators, arriving at precisely 1:30 for his Monday and Thursday appointments. I'd surveilled the location for 2 weeks, timing the gaps in foot traffic, identifying the moments when the parking structure was temporarily empty. The day I contaminated Vincent's car was a Thursday in late May, and I arrived 40 minutes before his scheduled therapy session. His Mercedes was already there in his preferred spot, and I parked several spaces away with a clear view of his vehicle and the security camera mounted on a pillar 15 feet away. The camera's angle covered the driving lanes but not the parking spaces themselves, a gap in coverage I'd verified by walking the structure multiple times. I waited until a group of medical residents passed by heading to their cars, then moved quickly during the gap in traffic. The bacterial solution went onto his door handle in 3 seconds, coating the surface where his hands would touch it multiple times. I was back in my car 20 seconds later, my heart pounding but my hands steady, watching the area for any sign that someone had noticed. Nobody emerged, no security guards came running, and I drove away knowing I'd just introduced a potentially lethal infection vector that would look like nothing more than environmental contamination. The bacteria would survive on the metal surface for hours, more than enough time for Vincent to touch it and introduce the pathogens through any microscopic breaks in his skin. Vincent developed a severe MRSA infection within 10 days, starting as a small cut on his hand that rapidly spread into a serious medical crisis. He was admitted to Mercy General's infectious disease ward, and I volunteered to take extra shifts in that area specifically so I could monitor his condition while maintaining my cover as a dedicated nurse. His doctors identified the infection and started aggressive antibiotic treatment, but his weakened immune system from months of previous medical problems made recovery difficult. I read his charts during my breaks, careful to access them only when I had legitimate reasons to be in the system, documenting my own patient's care while Vincent's file happened to be open in an adjacent window. The infection stabilized after 2 weeks but left permanent nerve damage in his hand, and I watched him leave the hospital in late June looking like a shadow of the man who'd walked out of minimum security prison 7 months earlier. But I still wasn't finished because the debt hadn't been paid in full, not while he still had his business and his marriage and his comfortable life mostly intact. I shifted strategies completely in July, abandoning direct medical intervention in favor of destroying Vincent's professional life through methods that couldn't be traced back to me. His investment firm had been struggling during his extended medical absence, and I created multiple anonymous online personas to accelerate that decline. I wrote detailed negative reviews on business rating sites, carefully crafted to sound like legitimate clients expressing concern about the firm's stability and Vincent's ability to lead. I posted questions in financial forums about whether investors should be worried about their money, seeding doubts that would spread organically. I sent anonymous emails to the firm's largest clients suggesting they might want to review their portfolios given the CEO's ongoing health crisis. Each action was small and untraceable, but cumulatively they created a narrative of instability that began driving clients away. I used public Wi-Fi networks and VPN services that routed through multiple countries, never posting from the same location twice, building a digital footprint that would be impossible to trace back to my real identity. Vincent's partners eventually forced him into early retirement with a buyout that was generous on paper, but represented the complete loss of the company he'd built over 20 years. Patricia filed for divorce in August, the final domino falling in Vincent's systematic destruction. The filing cited irreconcilable differences, but the timing suggested she'd reached her breaking point dealing with his medical crisis and their deteriorating finances. I tracked the court records obsessively, watching their assets get divided and their family home get listed for sale, satisfaction mixing with exhaustion because I'd been maintaining this campaign for nearly a year, and the constant vigilance was wearing me down. I'd lost weight, stopped sleeping properly, isolated myself from everyone who might notice I was becoming someone different than the person I'd been before Ethan's death. My ex-wife called occasionally to check on me, and I forced myself to sound normal, to make small talk about work and weather while concealing the fact that I'd become the kind of person who grew bacterial cultures to infect my son's killer. The distance between who I'd been and who I'd become felt infinite, but I couldn't stop because stopping would mean accepting that Vincent had gotten away with killing Ethan, and that was impossible to accept. September marked a year since Ethan's death, and I visited his grave for the first time since the funeral, because I'd been too consumed with destroying Vincent to properly grieve. Standing there, looking at the small headstone with dates that were far too close together, I felt something crack inside me. I'd accomplished what I set out to do, systematically destroying Vincent's health, career, and family, while remaining invisible as the cause. But standing at my son's grave, I couldn't feel triumph or closure, just emptiness, and the growing realization that nothing I'd done would bring Ethan back or fill the void his absence had created. I cried for the first time in months, not careful silent tears but deep gasping sobs that left me sitting on the ground with my back against his headstone. A groundskeeper approached to check if I was okay, and I pulled myself together, apologizing and leaving before anyone could see me completely break down. I drove home and sat in my apartment staring at the wall, understanding that I'd crossed lines I couldn't uncross and become someone I no longer recognized. I went back to Mercy General the next day and requested a transfer to the rehabilitation unit, telling my supervisor I needed a change after the difficult year I'd experienced. She approved immediately, and I moved to a new department, physically separating myself from the emergency department where I'd spent so many hours accessing Vincent's records and planning his destruction. The change helped break the obsessive patterns I'd fallen into, though I still found myself thinking about him constantly and wondering if he understood yet how completely his life had been dismantled. I heard through hospital gossip that he'd been readmitted in October for infection complications, that his prognosis remained uncertain, and part of me wanted to check his records one final time. But I forced myself to stop because I'd accomplished what I'd set out to accomplish, and continuing to pursue him would only increase the risk of eventual discovery. I started seeing a therapist, lying about the specifics but talking generally about grief and anger and the struggle to find meaning after loss. She was kind and competent and had no idea she was counseling someone who'd spent a year poisoning another human being. 3 months later, scheduling placed Vincent in my patient load at the rehabilitation unit without anyone realizing the connection between us. I saw his name on my assignment sheet one morning and felt my chest tighten, knowing I could request reassignment but choosing not to because I wanted to see him one final time. When the aide wheeled him into the treatment room, I turned to greet him with my professional smile in place, and he didn't recognize me. I was just another nurse in scrubs helping him through physical therapy exercises, invisible and forgettable. We worked through his rehabilitation routine in silence, his weakened body struggling with movements that should have been simple, and I documented his limitations in clinical language while feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Near the end of the session, he made small talk asking how long I'd been in rehabilitation, and I mentioned I'd transferred from the emergency department after a difficult year. Something shifted in his expression then. Discomfort, or perhaps recognition, and he said he was sorry I'd had a hard time. I thanked him with practiced grace and continued the exercises, watching his face carefully for any sign he understood who I was, but there was nothing. No recognition of me as someone whose life he'd destroyed, no connection between my grief and his actions. I finished the session professionally and documented his progress in the system, then stood at the nurse's station staring at his chart and making a decision. I could tell him who I was, could reveal everything I'd done and watch him understand that his year of suffering hadn't been random misfortune. But doing so would risk everything I'd accomplished and potentially expose me to prosecution for crimes I'd gotten away with through careful planning. The smarter choice was to let him remain ignorant, to let him die eventually, without ever knowing that his destruction had been orchestrated by the mother of the child he'd killed. I closed his chart and walked away, choosing silence over revelation, understanding that sometimes the best revenge is remaining invisible, while your enemy's life crumbles around them. Vincent would never know what I'd done or why his body had betrayed him so catastrophically, and that ignorance was perhaps more cruel than any confession could have been. I left Mercy General 2 weeks later, submitting my resignation and walking away from 12 years of nursing without explanation. My supervisor called multiple times, but I ignored the messages because there was nothing I could say that would make sense to anyone who hadn't lost a child to preventable violence. I'd used my medical knowledge to harm rather than heal, had become exactly the kind of person I'd once sworn to oppose, and continuing to work in healthcare felt like a betrayal of every oath I'd taken. I found work as a medical consultant for a law firm specializing in malpractice cases, using my clinical expertise to review charts and identify errors. The irony not lost on me that I was now professionally documenting the kind of harm I'd deliberately inflicted on Vincent. 6 months later, I saw a news article reporting that Vincent Caldwell had died from complications related to his ongoing health problems. The article was brief and made no mention of drunk driving or the child he'd killed, just painted him as a victim of mysterious medical decline. I read it twice and felt nothing. No satisfaction or regret, just acknowledgement that the story had reached its conclusion. Vincent was dead and Ethan was dead and I was alive carrying the weight of what I'd done. Whether that made me villain or something else entirely wasn't for me to judge. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.